The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
Beginning in the 1960s, inflation in the U.S. rose dramatically, reaching 13% in 1980. This increase was halted only after the Federal Reserve sharply tightened the money supply and raised interest rates, with Ronald Reagan's firm support. This sudden end to high inflation contributed to booms in the stock market and housing that continued for 2 decades. Newsweek and Washington Post columnist Robert Samuelson has called this rise and fall of inflation the most important economic event in the last half-century. He joins us now to discuss his latest book, The Great Inflation and Its Aftermath. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Bob Samuelson, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Nice to be with you, Doug.
You've written a wonderfully thoughtful and provocative book. It's called The Great Inflation and Its Aftermath. I, by the way, unreservedly recommend it to our audience. You take really the most vexing economic problems and make them accessible to the average reader. So it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And I hope it helps us all understand what's happening these days.
I do too.
So, the Great Inflation. What was it, and why did you decide to write a book about it?
Well, what it was, if you go back to the early 1960s, late 1950s, we didn't have any inflation in the United States. And by inflation, I mean not the rise of 1 or 2 prices, but the general rise of the price level, the rise of most prices. And it was measured at 1% in 1961, nothing, within the range of statistical error. By 1979, inflation is at double digits, it's 13%, it's roughly the same in 1980. Why did I write the book? Because I've covered the economy really over the last 40 years, and as I looked at what happened, this rise and fall of double-digit inflation really was the most important economic event of the last half-century. And I wrote the book to connect the dots, to explain the argument, and to show how pervasive its influence has been, both the rise and the fall, on American life during these decades.
Well, you've called this a history book in a way. Let's go over the history a little bit. So 1961 through the 70s in the inflation. What caused it? Who was responsible?
Well, this is a case where the basic cause was bad ideas, was bad policy decisions made based on economic doctrines that were promoted and embraced by really the leading economists in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And they argued that economists knew enough about how the economy ran to basically eliminate business cycles. They could smooth out the business cycles, keep the economy from going into recession, basically keep unemployment down at a very low level. Full employment was defined as 4%. And through that, they would basically maximize economic growth, maximize the national wealth, and create an economy that really we didn't have to worry about, and we could then argue about how we should use our greater wealth.
Now, you've mentioned that they thought they could use tools. We should talk a little bit about what those tools were.
Well, the basic tools were those that are familiar to most people who look at the economy, and that is first the federal budget. If the economy was growing slower than they thought it was possible to grow, they would run a deficit and they would prod the economy through this extra deficit spending. They would lower interest rates and make credit easier so people would borrow more, and then that would speed up economic growth. The idea was if economic growth was going too rapidly and you were beginning to see the signs of inflation, you could slow it down by having a tax increase or spending cut and pushing the budget back into surplus and raising interest rates.
Now Richard Nixon said, this is Keynesian economics, and I think he famously said, we are all Keynesians now, right?
This was John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, and one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, if not the most influential economist of the 20th century, died in 1946. His disciples christened this Keynesian economics, and perhaps Keynes would have embraced it, but we don't know. And this is one of the ironies of this, that this is labeled Keynesian economics, but Keynes was an intellectual godfather, but it's not clear he would have joined his own movement.
Why is that?
Well, because he understood how destructive inflation was, and he wrote strongly against inflation. And so as the policies that invoked his name created more inflation, it's not clear to me that he wouldn't have stepped back and said, look, folks, this is not going where we want it to go, and we need to adjust and make an amendment to what is called Keynesian economics. We just don't know. It's just one of these historical mysteries that will never be solved.
There was something else in the formula that you just described that sort of didn't ring true to me. So times are good, revenues are up, the economy is doing well, and you want the politicians to cut spending? This doesn't sound as if...
Well, one of the problems with this Keynesian formula is that the politicians didn't do what the economists expected them to do. So long as unemployment was down and there was no reason to cut spending or to raise taxes, they didn't do it. So essentially, the policies were programmed to self-destruct, because even if the underlying theory had been correct, which it wasn't, but even if the theory had been correct, the politicians wouldn't play their role. You had to run into visible, unpopular trouble, i.e. higher inflation.
Big trouble.
Really big trouble before the politicians would do things that were visible and unpopular. And that's not what the theory called for. The theory called for them to react to the first signs of higher inflation and also to react to the first signs of a slowing economy.
So let's pursue this a little bit, because I think it is important to think about this as history, because history has a tendency to repeat itself.
Sometimes, yeah.
The stimulus package, the first Kennedy tax cuts, the increases in spending, the increases of spending because of the Vietnam War. Spending is up, the economy heats up. And I think you write about the Fed 3 times trying to put the brakes on.
The Fed is a quasi-independent agency.
Quasi.
I say quasi because although legally it's entirely independent, it has to operate within the political system. And if the politicians get too angry at what it's doing, they will just change the law that gives the Fed its so-called independence. And the Fed, as all government central banks are supposed to, is supposed to be the guardian of the currency, of the value of the currency, keep inflation down so the money we use has an enduring, stable value. And so as inflation heated up in the 60s, the Fed tried and did occasionally raise interest rates. But they didn't raise them enough, they didn't keep them high enough, long enough to actually bring the inflation down, because as soon as they raised interest rate, there was an outcry. And the Fed, being sensitive to these political considerations, did the dirty work for a while, but not long enough to actually accomplish anything.
And so it just kept escalating.
So you would have these episodes of slower growth, and sometimes you'd have even recessions, but because the Fed would relent under the political pressure, you would get a moderation of inflation, then you would get a recovery, and the inflation would take off again and would get worse than it had been previously.
I think I once heard Arthur Burns say that Richard Nixon never forgave him for raising interest rates before the 1960 election, because that slowed down the economy, and Nixon attributed that slowdown to the fact that he lost.
Yes, and it wasn't Burns who raised interest rates. It was William McChesney Martin, who was then the chairman of the Fed. And Burns was, however, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, which was advising the president, and he went in and warned Nixon that this was about to happen. And so Nixon became hypersensitive to anything the Fed did, and when he actually named Burns to become chairman of the Fed in early 1970, he had Burns into the White House fairly often and applied very unsubtle pressure to him to keep interest rates down, especially before an election.
So after Nixon comes Ford, and if I remember correctly, it was whip inflation now, and we all had these little win buttons. And then came Jimmy Carter, and stagnation.
Stagflation.
Stagflation,
yeah.
Thank you. And a misery index.
Right. Misery index was, for those who don't remember, is a combination of inflation and unemployment. So if inflation was 8 or 9 or 10% and unemployment was 6 or 7%, you had a pretty high misery index.
Now, into this mix comes, again, the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. Many people don't remember he was appointed by Jimmy Carter.
Right. Well, he was appointed by Jimmy Carter, and people try to give credit to Carter for appointing him. I wouldn't give that much credit to Carter for appointing him because he appointed him out of desperation. Carter had fired many of his cabinet members, including the Secretary of the Treasury. This was in 1979. He was preparing for the 1980 election. He was not popular. He was trying to reinvigorate his administration, reshape its image, and he fired the members of the cabinet who he didn't get along with, didn't agree with, and that included the Secretary of the Treasury. So they had to appoint somebody as Secretary of the Treasury, and he couldn't get anybody to take the job. So he asked the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, G. William Miller, with whom he did get along, to take the job. And Miller did. Then they had a vacancy at the Fed, and he couldn't get
Treasury.
Wait, no, he's now filled the Treasury job with G. William Miller, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Now he's got a vacancy at the Federal Reserve. Can't get anybody to take that job either. Paul Volcker is the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, which is the most important Federal Reserve Bank. He has been in the Fed much of he's been in government and the Fed much of his public life. He was then 51, and he is available. He is known as being somewhat independent, a little bit cranky, and very, very determined to do what he thinks is right. So he's not a favorite of the Carter aides, but he's the only guy who will take the job, and so Carter appoints him because he has no choice, essentially.
And he raises interest rates.
He initially raises interest rates, and Carter goes along with that. But by early 1980, Carter is not particularly happy with this, and he institutes his own program to bring down inflation. The program backfires. The economy goes into a short recession. Inflation does come down briefly, and as soon as Carter's program is revised, because it's very unpopular, inflation takes off again. And Volcker, though, begins to really press down on inflation in late 1980 after Reagan has been elected. His initial program started in '79. It's interrupted by Carter's own independent program. But by late 1980, Volcker is making an effort to really crush inflation. He raises interest rates, he tightens credit, he squeezes the money supply, all the traditional things that central banks do to basically suppress inflation. And they suppress inflation by basically taking a sledgehammer to the economy, raising unemployment, creating gluts of everything. We have gluts of workers, we have gluts of cars, we have gluts of steel, we have gluts of textiles. And when you have too much supply and not much demand, prices begin to abate. And that's what happened with inflation. And this was the critical fulcrum point of the last 40 years, when Volcker undertakes this repression of inflation, and Reagan backs him up. And Reagan lets Volcker go on with this until the end of 1982.
And in your book, we should remind everyone, Reagan's popularity, or whatever, goes down to 35%. It plummeted. It plummeted. As inflation is going down, his popularity is going down.
Because unemployment is going up.
Right. But in the book, you seem to make him into a hero in this part of the story, at least, that he provided the political, your word is political cover.
Right. Volcker could not have done this unless he had political backing for this. Democrats and Republicans in Congress wanted him to relent, and he was afraid that if he relented too early, he would land in the same trap as the previous Fed chairman had done, that they had put the economy through a recession, but it hadn't been long enough or painful enough to basically convince people that the Federal Reserve in the future would not tolerate high inflation rates. And so that the wage price spiral and psychology that had taken hold in the 60s and 70s would essentially be purged from the economy. And so Volcker needed time to make this policy work. And Reagan gave him time by supporting Volcker in public and refusing to criticize him, even though he was being violently criticized from both Republicans and Democrats.
Now, Reagan was, I think he majored in economics when he was in college, but the common view of Reagan is not as a heavyweight on these kinds of things. What was going on in his mind, do you know? Do you think?
I don't know what was going on in Reagan's mind, and it's interesting that Reagan never actually, he claimed a lot of credit for reviving the economy, but he doesn't talk about suppressing inflation very much in his autobiography, and most of the people who have written about the Reagan administration just regard this as a minor episode. In my view, this was his major domestic accomplishment, and I don't think that any other conceivable president in 1980, not Carter, not Teddy Kennedy among the Democrats, not George Herbert Walker Bush or Howard Baker or John Connally among the Republicans, none of these men, if they had been elected, would have supported Volcker as long as Reagan did. Now you ask, why did he do it? In the book I say there was a compact of conviction between Reagan and Volcker. They did not have a lot of personal chemistry, but they both shared one conviction, and they shared it just automatically. They felt that the country could not prosper if we continued to tolerate high inflation. And Reagan was convinced that you had to go through a period of high unemployment and basically a sick economy until the inflationary psychology got squeezed out.
A very sick economy.
The highest unemployment reached 10.8%. It was a horrendous recession. The social costs of this were enormous, and most of the people who suffered were innocent victims. They didn't create the inflation, and yet they were put out of work. Their companies were put out of business. It was an awful episode. It was absolutely necessary, but while it was occurring, it was extraordinarily unpopular, and for very good reason.
Now, this is we're a nation now of 300 million souls, and the story you're telling is about happenstance and about individual personalities. This sounds like a very tenuous way to run a X-trillion-dollar economy.
This was a lucky coincidence to some extent, and you're right up to a point. But both of them had a basic understanding of what was going on. Volcker, obviously, at a technical level, had an enormous grasp of what was happening. Reagan didn't have a technical understanding of what the Fed was doing. He knew what the public knew, that the Fed had taken, as I said, a sledgehammer to the economy. He didn't understand all the definitions of different money supplies and the monetary base and all this kind of stuff. But he didn't have to. As Bill Niskanen, who was on Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors, pointed out to me, Reagan, unlike his predecessors, understood that you couldn't end inflation by regulation. You couldn't pass a law to end it. And in the previous administrations, starting with Lyndon Johnson's wage price guidelines and going through Richard Nixon's formal wage price controls, and then going to Jimmy Carter's, I think they were called wage price standards, there was a notion promoted by many economists that you could essentially put out guidelines or rules and people would obey the rules and inflation would go down.
Just like Russia. I remember getting a suit during the Nixon price controls, and they had this list of what every suit cost at a certain date, and that was the price of the suit. But the Washington people had neglected to regulate the cost of alterations. So the alterations were $75.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what happens with wage price control. People want markets. And if you regulate the market in some way, they try to find a way about it.
Now, this is all such a happy story, but
it's not,
as we talk now, that was then, now is now.
Yeah.
The economy is slowing down, if not in recession. The stock market is down. Businesses are closing. What happened between then and now?
Well, the economy is in serious straits, and I attribute this recession as the final sad climax or consequence of the disinflation of the last 25 years.
Now, why is that?
Yeah. Well, what happened is as inflation came down in the early 80s, and it came down very abruptly. It came down from about 13% in 1979 to 4% in 1983 and 84 because the Reagan-Volcker suppression was so powerful. As it came down, interest rates also came down. It came down more slowly because people weren't convinced that inflation would stay down. After all, they'd had 15 years of rising inflation, and they weren't certain that the Fed would really do what Volcker said it would do. So interest rates came down more slowly. But as interest rates came down, people took money out of money market funds and out of Treasury securities and put them in the stock market. And we started basically a 25-year stock market boom. In 1982, and people forget this, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was under 1,000. It was basically where it had been in 1965. And over the next 5 or 6 years, it just soared. By the end of the 90s, it was over 10,000. So people got the idea that, yeah, stocks fluctuate, as J.P. Morgan said, but they basically go up. And if they go down a little bit, you just have to wait it out because they're going to go up. And year in and year out, we were having basically double-digit increases in the stock market. And we conditioned an entire generation of investors, both amateur investors and professional money market managers, portfolio managers, that stock prices would go up. The same thing happened with housing prices. As mortgage interest rates came down, people could afford higher priced homes, the price of homes went up. And let me remind people what happened to mortgage rates. In 1981, 82, they averaged roughly 15%. By the end of the 80s, they were down to about 10%. By the end of the 90s, they were down to 7%. So all during this period, you were having a kind of increase in the price of stocks, an increase in the price of homes. People got wealthier. They felt wealthier, so they spent more of their current income to buy things, and they borrowed more because they had more to borrow against, including their houses. And we had a consumption boom in the United States, so basically a 20-year spending spree that propelled the economy forward. And for a while, this was, I think, rested on very solid economic foundations. The problem arose, perversely, and this is what history is all about. You can't plan it, things happen. Good things lead to bad results sometimes. This was a good thing, suppressing inflation. But it led to a bad result when people got the idea that only prices could go in one direction. And that really stimulated speculative practices in both housing and stocks.
Yeah, we have just a little bit more time in this program. You're putting the attribution or the blame on people, you've said, and the decline in interest rates. What about the government? What about regulating, whether it's the way mortgages are written, the way stock accounts can be leveraged? Didn't that play some part of this?
You know, we're going to have dozens of postmortems on this crisis. And most of them, perhaps all of them, will argue that if we had intervened at the right time, the crisis could have been avoided. And maybe they're correct. I'm a little bit skeptical because once a bandwagon gets started, it's very hard to stop. And I take as my evidence of that the so-called tech and dot-com boom of the late 1990s. During that episode, when stock prices rose to unrealistic levels and many of these new high-tech companies had prices that could not be justified on any basis.
And no business plan.
Basically, no business model, and the prices couldn't be justified. And even when the companies were viable companies, the prices were at astronomical and irrational levels. And lots of people warned about this. Warren Buffett warned about it. There were actually, at some of the major brokerage houses, investment strategists that warned that there was a bubble coming into being, that these prices were unrealistic. People didn't listen. The train had left the station. Everybody wanted to be on it. And the only thing that convinced people that prices got too high was when prices started to go down. And then they realized that we had a bubble. But when things are going well, it's very hard to stop. And the same thing happened with the housing crisis to a lesser extent. Delinquencies were very low in 2004, 2005. People made crazy loans and people took out crazy loans and prices went up.
Now's the time for questions from our audience, and if you'd like, introduce yourself and say who you are.
My name is Marcia Cass, and I wanted to ask, you said that, or you implied that it took World War II to get the United States out of the Great Depression. Will it take war to get the United States out of the deep recession that it's in now?
Well, I hope not, because I think if we were to have a real war, a big war now, and I don't, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan is very serious if you are on the ground there. But compared to the war, World War II, it's a small conflict. In World War II, we spent roughly 45% of our national income on the government, basically on the military. We are now spending 4% of our national income on the military, including the war in Iraq. So, no, I don't think we need a war to get us out of this recession. I certainly hope not.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's not that difficult to stop a program when the time is up. But we'll continue this discussion when we talk about what's going to happen to try to fix the economy and what the future of the American economy is like. But right now, let me just thank Bob Samuelson for being with us, and let me say to our audience, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write to us at www.policywatch.umd, that's UMD for University of Maryland, by the way, .edu. Bob Samuelson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance, and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.